Okay, well, we're at 1:06, so maybe we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for deciding to spend what is really turning out to be a beautiful afternoon here with us to talk about budgets. Always a fun topic. I am Vivian Van Gelder. I am the Seattle Council PTSA Area Director for District 5. That's basically the central district. And I am also a person who is really interested in school budgets and have spent a lot of time trying to understand what goes on with school budgets and why it always seems like every year we have a crisis. I don't know if it feels that way for the rest of you, but it sort of seems to feel that way every year, like, oh my goodness, it's just always bad. And what I want to do is just do a really high level kind of basic description of what I understand the process to be, where the money comes from, what happens to it once it gets into the district, and how it gets out to your school. And then I hope for this to be kind of interactive. I don't want to just be talking at you. So if you have questions along the way, I encourage you to either put those in the chat or to raise your hand. And I'm going to rely on my fellow council members, Sam Fogg and Melanie Jorgensen, to help me notice when folks have their hands up or there's questions in the chat. And then there should be quite a bit of time at the end of what I have to say for us to have a bigger discussion if there's interest. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. I have a couple slides, not too many, and we'll get started. So first of all, hopefully you can all see my screen there. Is that showing up for folks? Yeah, great. Thank you, Kirsa. Alrighty, so this is a meeting of PTA. It's always important to start by reminding ourselves of what our mission actually is. And our individual PTAs often have their own missions that are versions of this, but as
Vivian, can I ask you to pause for a moment? Ayan Singh does not hear Mr. Sarai in the Somali room. I just want to make sure that our interpretation is okay.
All right, I'm checking.
It's not set yet.
Oh. Let's see. Sorry, guys.
Logrando involucrar y empoderar a las familias y a las comunidades para abogar por por los niños en general. Eso es básicamente lo que dice lo que está en la pantalla en este momento. Y de nuevo es la misión de la asociación en general.
See if that works.
Should I keep going? Is that working?
Let's just do a quick check. Is interpretation?
Is that better?
Hold on, waan ku maqlaa. Ay, Sarah.
I can hear him. Okay.
Great. Okay. So yeah, so just to get us all focused in the right space, as we go through this conversation, especially those of us who are here on behalf of PTAs, just a reminder that this is our mission. Our mission is advocacy for all children. This is important for this conversation because as community members, as parents, families, and teachers, as folks involved in the education system, our power in this system is advocacy. Most of us are not directly involved in making the decisions that lead to school funding and to funding at specific schools, but we do have the power to come together and advocate for different ways to do things. And when we're thinking about advocacy, we need to think we need to understand the system that we're working with so we know what to advocate for and we know where the decision points are. And when we're advocating, we also need to remember who we're advocating for. If we're representing PTAs and we're doing this as PTAs, we're not advocating for our own children specifically or for our schools, though we may be doing that. We're really advocating for all of the children in our district. Okay. So I wanted to start with what the sources of funding for our schools are. So sort of a very high level, where does the money come from? And this is this image is taken from last year's Seattle Public Schools approved budget. So this is for last year, but it's representative of the general breakdown of the sources of funding for our schools every year. And you can see that the largest portion comes from the state. The biggest portion of funding for our schools comes from our state, followed closely by local taxes. These are our local, there's 3 local levies that the school district runs. You may have voted in those this year. They were just last month, we had a levy ballot. And then federal is the 3rd largest portion of our funding. We do get funds from the federal government, but those are generally quite small. They're usually actually a smaller share than this, but because of the additional funding that was sent to schools and school districts because of the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic on schools, that portion is actually quite a bit bigger than it normally would be. So that's just to give you a general overview of where all the money is coming in from. And as you can see, we have a budget for our district that's over $1 billion. So this is a pretty sizable budget. Then I wanted, so this looks very busy, and I promise I'll break it down. So now we know where the money is coming from. How do we know how much money is coming in, and how is that determined? And it gets kind of complicated. There are a lot of moving parts to this. So I felt like the easiest way to break it down was by how specific sources of funding are, the amount of each source is how it's determined. So there are funds that are determined by how many students you have enrolled in the free and reduced price meal program in your district. There are funds that are determined by the number of students to be served by specific programs. And then there are funds that are determined by just how many students you have in your district. And then finally, there are funds that don't fit into any of those 3 categories. So I'm going to start from the left and just briefly give an overview of each of these. So the 2 sources of funding that come into our school district that are determined by how many students we have enrolled in the free and reduced price meal program are federal Title I dollars and this funding through the State Learning Assistance Program. And that is, the State Learning Assistance Program is intended to provide basically academic intervention services, though not only academic, but that's primarily what they're used for. And those are allocated on the basis of how many students you have in your district who are enrolled in that program. Moving to the second box, there are 3 sources of funding that are linked to student characteristics, meaning that only students who have been demonstrated to have these particular characteristics you're going to be funded to serve those students with these funds. So IDEA is the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that provides specific funding for students with identified disabilities. And this is supplemented by state special education funding, which is also similarly restricted to students who have been identified for special education programming or services, sorry. And then the third source here is the state, it's called the Transitional Bilingual Instruction Program. And it is intended to serve students who are learning English. So those are the 2 programs that are really restricted by some characteristic of the students who are in your district. The third source of funds is determined just by the number of students. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands this is a really highly simplified kind of schema. This is not, there's so much more detail to it, but this is kind of just broadly the way that this works. So I know that there will be folks out there who probably have more information than I have or understand more about these programs than I do, who are saying, but so I do, I know that there is a lot more to this, but this is just a pretty high level explanation. So the third box there are funds that are determined by total enrollment. So the state does provide a basic allocation for every student in your district. And that is determined by a formula called the prototypical school funding formula. And the way that that works, very briefly, is for every, no, I can't even explain it simply, for every batch of students in your district, you are allocated a certain number of types of staffing. So for example, the state has determined that the prototypical size for a school, for an elementary school, is 400 students. And for those 400 students, they allocate a certain amount of principal time, secretary time, classroom teacher time, and so forth. And then when you add all the students in your district, that's how those positions are, that's how the funds are allocated, not the positions, sorry, that it's just money that's coming into your district. And then the SPS operations levy, SPS runs 3 levies. One is for capital works, so rebuilding schools essentially. Another is the building technology and athletics levy, which funds what it says. And then the operations levy is really the levy that is money for our schools, for running our schools. It goes for materials, supplies, operating costs, and additional staffing costs that aren't covered by the state. And then the funds at the bottom there in that yellow box there, that's the federal ESSER dollars are the funds that were allocated to all school districts to help support schools during the COVID emergency. And so those have a sunset. Those are not funds that are ongoing. They're just funds that have been allocated for, I guess it's a 3 to 5 year period, and then they will theoretically go away. And then the final box over here are funds that are not part of state or federal or local government processes. They're not government funds. They're not funds that come from taxation. Well, actually, I lied. The first is, so there's SPS has its levies, and then there's a separate levy, education levy, that's run by the city of Seattle. And I'm not looking at the chat, so if anybody has pressing questions, I hope someone can let me know. So the city has its own education levy. It's called the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy. And it's pretty big, and it includes free public preschool and includes Seattle Promise, which is for college. But it does include a K-12 component, and that money, which is city tax money, obviously, that money goes directly to schools when they apply for it. It's a competitive application process, so there are always more schools that apply for it than receive it. But it can be a relatively significant amount of money for a school. There are then PTA funds, so when PTAs raise money and donate that to schools in any form, whether it be a staffing grant or whether it be classroom supplies or anything like that, that's money that goes into our schools, but it usually ends up staying at the school at which it's raised. And then there are other private grants and donations that come from other organizations, such as the Gates Foundation will sometimes grant, and there are other private foundations that provide grants to our school district, and those are relatively small. So that's just a really big high level picture. I want to stop. I'm just going to check the chat here to make sure that, oh, this is great. And so folks are providing additional information. Oh yeah, I want to amplify what Sam has said there about encouraging families to fill out the paperwork for free and reduced lunch. Even though everyone's getting food right now without needing to be enrolled in that program, it is used to determine a lot of this funding. So if our enrollment numbers for that program drop a lot, it's going to affect the funding that we get from the federal government and also some of the state funding as well. Idea funding. So Kristen's question here is, does the IDEA funding and the state special ed funding, is it based on the same pool of students? Yes. My understanding is yes. It's just generally students receiving special education services. And I'm not sure if Sam has any additional insight into that, but that is my understanding. It's basically, it's intended to be additional funding for districts to serve those students.
Vivian, I put it in the chat, but IDEA funding is the federal level funding for so both of those groups of funding are meant to support the same pool of students. When the IDEA was originally written, the intent or the stated intent was for them to eventually fund 40% of the cost of special education from the federal level. That has never happened. They have never gotten that high. President Biden has talked about getting it up to that level. When he came into office, IDEA was funding at about 13.5%, sometimes around 14%. And so that's why you see both of those there for the same pool of students, is because neither of those actually cover the full cost. And in Seattle, we use IDEA, and then we also use state funding for special education. Washington puts a cap on the number of students for whom they will provide funding for special education. They cap it at 13.5. And we in Seattle use both those monies and also levy monies. So we end up with about half of the funding that we spend on special education is coming from our levies. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Sam. And Nicole, I see your question, and we will actually, I'm not specifically going to talk about this, but we can definitely, it comes up a little later, so we can specifically talk about that then. But I see your question and we will get it answered. Oh, yeah, okay. I love this picture. This comes from the state. I'm not sure which agency produced it, but it's the universe of where our state operating budget goes. There are three budgets at the state level. The biggest one is the operating budget by far, and then there are two others. I think it's capital and transportation, if I have that correct. Sam, correct me if I'm wrong. The other two are much, much, much smaller. This is by far the biggest. This is, for all intents and purposes, this is our state budget in terms of where the money is. And we often are told that our only options when we want to advocate around school funding is to advocate to the state for more money. But as you can see there, we're starting this is an uphill battle, because you can see the size of the K-12 portion of our state budget compared to everything else. So it is actually around just under 50% of the state budget operating budget is spent on K-12 schools. Yeah, it's big. So when we go into conversations with legislators and say we need more money, they're like, well, we're already spending half the state's money on, I mean, it's not half, but half the state's operating budget on public schools. So, how is that not enough? That's kind of and not all of them, obviously, they don't all think that way, but that's kind of, they know that, they're aware of the fact that this is the biggest single line item on our state's budget. And of course, that says as much about how much money is in our state budget as it does about how much we're dedicating to, or what portion we're dedicating to schools. So we don't necessarily spend more than other states on school funding, but we do spend this much proportionally on education in our state. So just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about different places in the system to advocate. And what I hope that you come away with is a feeling that there are other levels that we can also advocate at. Like, it is necessary to advocate at the state level, but we need to also be advocating at other levels, because this state level conversation really ends up being a conversation about the income streams for our state. So taxation, essentially. On to so now we know how funding gets into our district. So we have a little idea about how the funding gets into the district. And now I want to move on to what's the process for determining how that money comes from our district out to our schools. So we're coming down another level. So we do have a school board policy that that requires our district to have a funding model, and it establishes it's called the model bit that is used is called a weighted staffing standards model. And this policy requires that we have a weighted staffing standards work group that every year looks at this model and adjusts it. And the weighted staffing standards work group is primarily made up of district staff and school principals. And it does move around slightly every year. Sometimes there are representatives from the teachers union and the principals association as well, but it's essentially staff and principals that work on this document. And their role, according to the policy, the role of the work group is to allocate the funding received from these outside sources, from most outside sources, in a way that there's principles according to which this money should be distributed. This is in the policy. And of course, it has to be within the confines of the district's annual budget. Not all of the money that I talked about on the previous slide is within the district's annual budget. So it doesn't get allocated through this model. And the things that are outside of the district's annual budget are grants for specific schools, donations for specific schools, and city levy funds. Those things do not go through the district or through this process. They're not allocated through this process. Okay. And then the weighted staffing standards model itself is just a little snippet from it. It'll literally tell you, it's based on enrollment, and it will tell you there are different ones for elementary schools, K-8 schools, middle schools, high schools, alternative schools. So there are different ones for each. And it will literally tell you if you have this many students with these characteristics, you get this many teachers, administrators, staff members, and a little bit of money as well, like actual dollars to spend. Okay. So again, very busy slide, and I promise to go through it slowly. This is, again, a really high level look at how this process works. So we start with, over on the left here are all those sources that I mentioned 2 slides back or 3 slides back, that are generated in different ways. Those all come into our district, and they're essentially run through the weighted staffing standards formula, which generates specific budgets for individual schools. And the tricky part is that each of these sources of money has restrictions on how it can be spent, not how it can be spent, but where it can be spent. So for example, as I said, the special education funds can only be spent to serve students receiving special education services. Same with language dollars, and then other monies are, so the state basic allocation is much more discretionary. The district has a lot more power to allocate that any way they want. So when they say things like we're only funded for 9 nurses, but we employ 63 or 68, I think it is, they're not technically funded. They don't have to use that money for nurses. That's not, they could decide that they wanted to use all of the money that they get. They could use money from the state to fund all of those nurses. So they say they use the levy money that they get, the district levy money, the operations levy money. That is what makes up that other portion of the nursing staff. But they could elect to take those funds from the state allocation. And then, of course, they wouldn't have those funds to use somewhere else. So it's not technically correct to say that they aren't funded for X specific spots. It's just that the money that's generated is generated for that amount of nurses. That probably sounds very confusing, but anyhow, so they take all of the restrictions on spending that money that's in the box there. And then there are other restrictions that live outside of that box. They're not connected to the funding source, but there are other restrictions. So there's some of you may remember this, back in, I think it was 2014, there was a ballot initiative 1351, that set class limit caps or class limits for class size. So there are pretty strict limits on how big classes can be. There's often a lot of confusion about how those are calculated, but there are limits on class sizes, and those have to be met in order for schools to get funding that's tied to that. So those are required. And then there are other requirements on how the money can be allocated that are found in collective bargaining agreements with Seattle Education Association and with the Principals Union, and outside of specific schools, I assume with other unions such as the Custodians Union.
سؤال قبا.
And then once
سؤال
that-
قبا. magacayga ayag may maqlaan. I hope may maqleen.
once all of that money has been
سؤال قبا. سؤاشا waxa weeye waxaad weydiisaa ee hooyadana rabta inay ogaato hadda waxay ka sheekeynaysaa IDA-ga special education-ka. Okay, caruurteena horta first waa general education student bay yihiin. Go waa lacag halkaas ka timaada oo gooni ah. Then ka bacdi markii la ogaado cunugii inuu baahan yahay caawimaad qaasa, check wuxuu noqdaa ka bacdi wuxuu noqdaa waxay eegaan cunuga language labaad ma ku hadlaa oo ELL baa soo galaya lacaga. Soo maaha. Then ka bacdi waxaa la ogaadaa cunuga inuu u baahan yahay special education imtixaan baa laga qaadaa. Special education kii baa soo gala. Saddexdaas lacag baa anagana soo gasha.
Oops. Alrighty, and then once all of those sources have gone through the formula, after that, these other sources of funding are applied. So PTA funds do not go through the funding formula. There's a misconception that those funds
Sere.
taken into account. Oh, okay, again.
Ha.
That those funds are taken into account when school
Gabadha waxay
budgets
ka
are-
sheekaystay special education is underfunded waan ognahay taas laakiin
Melanie,
anagu
are you
saan
there?
ognahay cunug walba oo buildingkaas soo gala
Hold on,
iskuulka soo
hold on,
gala
hold
waa
on, main
general
room ka ku
education
jirtaa.
student buu ku yahay
Hold on, you're in the main room right now. Do you want to switch to the interpretation?
hooyadaa rabta inay ogaato
Horan is in the Somali room, but when she speaks, the whole room can hear her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm almost done here. So
There was a mom that was asking a
hooyada
question. I
hooyadaa rabta inay
believe.
ogaato hooyo kala
There
layn
was
ku
a mom that
jirta
was asking a question.
Can I ask who is interpreting in the Somali room currently?
Mr.
Mohammed.
Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
dhinaca
Okay.
kale aadaysa it's okay
That's how we have it set up.
But Hodan, is there a question coming out of the Somali room that that Vivian needs to answer?
yeah so there was the mom is saying okay we went over the Vivian, you went over you talked about the IDA and the special education. We know that it's underfunded, but according to what the mom is saying is that our students are first general education students, so
Mhm.
that there should be fundings from there. And then she said that then, you get tested, you find out your child is an ELL, they speak second language at home, there's a funding there. And then there's the funding from special education. So what she's saying is that where all those where other two fundings are going when we're only focusing on special education funding.
Oh, she's absolutely right. Yes. And I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. Every student is a general education student first. And then special education funding sits on top of that. And also the ELL funding is on top of that. It's almost like a weighting. So, if every student is a 1, then I can't tell you the proportion, but maybe every special ed student is 1.2, so yes, that's absolutely right. And please thank her for clarifying that, because that's absolutely true.
And Vivian, I want to clarify one other thing about special education funding. The cost, the amount of funding allocated to a particular student, it depends on the services that student requires. And so the amount of money that a student needs is what it costs to fulfill the IEP or the 504. And so the amount that the district pays out, that they are legally obligated to find the money for whatever is in the IEP. So if it's in the IEP, if that's what the student needs, then that's what they have to pay. And so when we're talking about where the money is coming from, but when we're talking about how it gets pushed out to the individual student, it is supposed to be according to the need of the student. For some students, that amount of money is not going to be significantly more. For other students, it will be significantly more than what it costs for a general education student, and that is okay. There's also safety net funding because some students have significantly more expensive needs, and there is the option to apply for something called safety net funding from the state. So that's an additional layer that can come into it. But funding for a particular student, the way it gets spent on that student should be according to the individual education plan. I hope that helps.
And I want to underline a couple of things you said. So 1, whatever the child needs should be in their IEP, and legally the school should put whatever the kid needs in their IEP. And 2, whatever is in their IEP, the school is obligated to deliver regardless of the funding we're talking about.
Correct, but what parents think that their student needs may be different than what the law specifies that their student needs. And that's where sometimes it can get confusing. So students are supposed to receive a free and accessible public education. That's FAPE. And if the student needs something for their education, it's supposed to go into their IEP. We can have a much bigger conversation. I'll be here for drop-in hour after this, so we can go into this in more detail if people want to. But yes, if it's in the IEP, the district has agreed that that is something that your student needs, and they need to find funding for it. And they need to make it happen. So, yes.
Thank you, Sam. Can I please add? I know we gotta go. The time is running. So what about if the child is only fully in special education all day? Maybe the only general education he or she is whoever they're receiving is PE. So where that general education funding go if the child does not receive those services?
It's still, so it often doesn't, when you look at their budget, you're not necessarily going to see it broken out in that way, but all of the expenses related to educating that child should go to, it's not like there's extra money floating around, right? The more the student is in a restricted setting, there's additional costs with that. So the money for general education still should go to that student, and the money that is required to fulfill the IEP should go to that student. And if that student needs other services related to bilingual or one of the other restricted accounts, that should also still go to that student. On the family side, the family shouldn't have to know or feel the weight of the cost. The family should only have to negotiate what the student needs, and then it is on the district to make it happen. But the family should not be responsible or feel obligated to source funding for their child's education. That should not be something that is not a burden that should be put onto parents. I know that when we go into our IEP meetings, a lot of times they start talking about, well, we don't have funding, or that's not supposed to be part of the conversation. The fact that it is, I do not want to negate that. That happens too often. It's not supposed to be. To the family, it should just be, this is what the student needs. We negotiated it with the team, and the funding arrives. I know that's not how it works, but that is what is supposed to happen. And I think it's important to know what's supposed to happen, so that when we're in those spaces and that's not what happens, we know that something's going wrong. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Adam, for the question, because this is really important stuff, and I'm learning too. So I appreciate that. Yeah, just to finish up this slide here. So all of those monies that are coming in, those government sources of money are coming in and go through the weighted staffing standards formula and out to schools. And then after that process has happened, these other funds in purple are applied. They are not part of the weighted staffing standards formula process. They're separate from it. And I think I was saying that there is a misconception that the district takes available PTA funds into account when making budgets for schools, and that is not the case. Those funds are applied after this process occurs. And the same is true for city levy funds. They're not part of the weighted staffing process, and neither are other private grants or donations. That is all I have in terms of slide presentation, but I wanted to go back to the question earlier, and I think it was Nicole who asked about per student funding. And I wonder if folks are interested in looking at an actual allocation for a specific school and maybe working through that really briefly, just to understand what it looks like and what it means, because sometimes, especially folks who are on a building leadership team will see this particular budget. You can find it on the district's website as well, and look at it and say, well, what does that all mean? And it's a little tricky to figure out. So I am going to pull up a random one of these and share it with you. Oops, sorry. It's taking me a moment to move all my screens around. Okay. And again, if there are questions, I'm more than happy to stop for us to talk about. So I've just picked Lowell truly at random. This is the allocation that Lowell Elementary in Capitol Hill received this year as part of its budget allocation. And you can see across the top there are a couple of things in little writing that says High POV 1, Tier 2, and allocations distributed. So Tier 2, you might be familiar with the concept of equity tiering. And I wasn't planning to go into it, but we'll happily do so if there's interest. Equity tiering essentially takes various characteristics of students at each school and determines how far they are from the mean, from the average of all of the schools in the district for that characteristic, and then assigns a tier. And tier 1 is considered the highest need, I guess. And I say I guess because it's not solely based on, say, enrollment in free and reduced lunch programming, which is used as a proxy for poverty. It's not just that, it's other things. It's I think it includes how many students are experiencing homelessness, how many students are in foster care, how many students of color furthest from educational justice you have. They've actually changed it a little this year, and I don't have it at the top of my head what all the criteria are this year. But essentially, tier 1 is shorthand. You can say it's highest need, and tier 4 is lowest need, essentially. So we have a school here, it's tier 2, so it's pretty close to the top based on whatever the characteristics of their students are. So these these budget allocations are divided into 2 parts, well, 3 parts really. But you'll see at the top here, it says staffing allocations. Right under that gray bar, there's a little, right there, it says staffing allocations. And that top section that says staffing allocations, right down to that blue box that says total staffing, parentheses, FTE allocation, tells you how many people, essentially, how much FTE, full-time equivalent staffing that you are allocated in your building in these different categories. And there's a formula, and the formula that I showed you that little snippet of it before. For elementary schools, the formula will tell you for every X number of kids, you get this much teacher FTE. So if your enrollment drops, your classroom teacher FTE will drop. There are different class size limits for students for high poverty schools and non-high poverty schools. So high poverty schools, according to state law, are those with enrollment above free and reduced lunch program enrollment above 50%. So those schools have smaller class sizes, which means that you end up with more classroom teacher FTE. When you look at, if you look down at the section that says teaching, and it's got teacher K3, 4, 5, and then it says elementary teacher PCP. And PCP teachers are your art teacher, your PE teacher, maybe your music teacher. Those teachers are PCP stands for preparation, conference, and planning time. And teachers, according to the contract between the teachers union and SPS, teachers are entitled, well, actually it's at the state level too, but teachers are entitled to a certain amount of their day where they're not in front of students and they get to plan, otherwise they have to do it at home. We all know they do it at home anyway, but there is a part built into their day where they're supposed to have time to plan their lessons. So those teachers are there to partly to cover that preparation time. And they're allocated as a percentage of the amount of classroom teacher FTE. So when you take that total there, and here we have 15 classroom teachers. So the PCP teacher allocation is 12.5% of that. That's just the way that they calculate it. And everything else is calculated according to how many students you have with those characteristics. So under there you have special education. So again, that's special education students generate that FTE. Bilingual students or multilingual students will generate that bilingual teacher allocation. And then the other things, the principal's office, the library, the counseling, those are a little more fluid. And those are places where the weighted staffing standards work group can move things around a little bit every year. I think I saw, was Hadan's hand up?
Yeah, Vivian, thank you. I'm looking under the non-staff allocation, and I'm looking under the SPED preschool. It says it is also special education. It says special education supplies, and then under that it says IEP writing stipend. Is that stipend what I'm thinking? Stipend? Can you clarify that? What does that mean?
Yep. Yeah. That there's a stipend, and I believe this is in the teacher's contract, that any staff member who's responsible for writing and administering IEPs will receive a stipend for their time spent doing so. So that's a stipend that goes to staff.
Thank you. And would that be, with all due respect, we know families like us, we do help the teacher as well. And I'm not saying the teacher should not get, I think teachers, special education teachers are mostly underpaid, we know that. But who's also paying family stipend, spending hours and hours and taking off from work and going through the IEP, and then also going through the hours and hours for the evaluation. I mean, it's so much time that families are, I'm also putting as well. Well, a lot of families do that, like reviewing and making sure everything is clear. And I think families are totally like they're partners with teachers, and they should also get stipends for that.
I could not agree more. And the issue is that these budgets are designed, and the conversation about where all this money is going doesn't involve families at all. This process does not involve us or concern us. These numbers are negotiated between principals, the teachers union and other unions, and the district. And families are not, our voice is not any part of this process. So that's why I encourage you to think about other places where you can advocate around this, because right now it's not that anyone's keeping us out. It's just that the rules that are being applied to generate these allocations don't take into account families. They're not designed for families. They're designed very specifically around all of the other stakeholders in this system. And I have a big problem with that. You know, I think that, like, you've hit the nail on the head. You've raised something here that I think is so important. And it's that this is not designed with families in mind. It's actually not even really designed with students in mind. It's designed to comply with legal obligations and contractual obligations. And those are all to adults and to adult employees, like all of our employees. And again, these are all appropriate things. These are things that should happen. These are what our teachers need. These are what our staff need. But there isn't a place where families can have input into what we need, like what this needs to look like for our kids and for us as families. I think I saw a few more other hands up.
Nicole has her hand up, Vivian.
Nicole?
Thank you. And thank you, Vivian, for going over the WSS model more. My question regarded if you could confirm the per pupil funding by tier, because what I pasted in that text also was from the 2020-23 draft for the WSS, and it looks like it's 103 for basic ed, and the tiers, equity tiers are
actually not. Right, it's actually not in any way. So equity tiering does not really play a role in WSS at all. There's not, I mean, there are a couple of things that maybe are done that way, but in general, it doesn't really have any direct role in how this document is generated. And what you're talking about, if you look under non-staff allocations, that's the second section of this document. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can't, it's sort of halfway down the page. And if you go down, you've got teaching, special ed, it says SPED preschool, bilingual, and under that it says per pupil and equity dollars. And this is the part, this is what you're referring to. So this budget is money. The budget above, it's really important to understand, even though there's a dollar amount at the end of the column there, that's not money. You don't, that's not a budget that your school gets. So here we have 41, and I promise to get to your question, Nicole, I will. We have 41.0 FTE allocated for staffing at the school at a cost of it says just under $5 million. We have no idea what that's going to cost. Those are not actual numbers. Those numbers don't refer to the people who are working in the building. Those numbers are all averages for those positions. So for example, where it says teacher K-3, that $1.4 million does not refer to the cost of employing the people who are currently in the building. It refers to the cost of employing 10.5 teachers at the average rate that K-3 teachers earn in our district. So we don't have any information about what is actually spent. It's very difficult to find. Now, this is a budget. A budget says what you intend to spend or what you could spend. There isn't any easy way to correlate that number there with what is actually spent in a school. There are plenty of teachers who earn less than the district-wide average. So if you have a lot of teachers who earn less than the district-wide average, you're going to spend a lot less than this, but you'll never know it. Okay, that's a separate thing. And when you go to the second part of this document, the non-staff allocations, that is money. That's actually actual money. So the top part is not money, it's just people. The bottom part is actual money. And then those two line items, per pupil and equity dollars, are really the only discretionary money that the school can use. Everything else is kind of set out for them. Like you have to spend, it's like your bills every month. You have to pay a certain amount for your utilities or your, you have fixed costs. Those two line items are the only untied free money that schools have to spend. So the per pupil, the per student discretionary allocation there, that means that for every student in your school, no matter what their characteristics, this year you will get $103 that you can use for anything within reason. There are parameters, but you can use those dollars. Those are free dollars. Equity dollars are not tied to tiering. Equity dollars are tied to the number of students you have enrolled in free and reduced lunch in your school. And it's a sliding scale depending on what grade they're in. If they're in kindergarten, you get a certain amount. If they're in second, third grade, if they're in fourth, and I'm just talking elementary here. There's different numbers for middle and high school. But those are not tied to tiering at all. They're tied to your school's enrollment of free and reduced lunch. That is not the amount your school is getting for every student. Your school is getting way, 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 way more for every student. That's just the amount of actual dollars that is going to go into your school's little account with the district, that when an expense comes up outside of staffing, then your school can say, okay, we've got a little bit of money for that. So I don't know, we ran out of copy paper or we need, I'm trying to think, we need a laminator. Like those are the things that amount of money there, and there are rules about how you can spend it too, but that's what that money is. It doesn't mean that's all the money you're getting for your students. It means that that's the amount of money they're allocating you as actual dollar money that you can spend, because the rest of it is spent for you. There is very little flexibility. Once this budget gets to your building, within the confines of this document, there is very little that you can move around. Now, if you have PTA money, that feeds into that per student discretionary allocation. Now you have a much bigger pool of money that you can use to spend on whatever you want. So that per pupil and equity dollar amount is what you can use for additional staffing time if you need to. And in fact, they encourage you to use that money for that first. So if you want to hire more staff, if you want more FTE than you're given in that top part, you need to find it there unless you have another source of funds. So I'm going to stop there because
you've got a question in the chat from Carissa. It says, when Vivian is talking about average numbers for salaries being used, is that even for budget like we're looking at for a specific school? Are these not actual numbers for Lowell Elementary?
They are not actual numbers. This does not tell you anything about how much staffing costs at Lowell Elementary. It tells you that if everybody in that school earned the average amount that specific role earns in SPS. So if you took all the counselors in SPS, added up all their salaries and divided by the number of counselors that we have, it would give you 60, or actually I guess this is 0.5. So $132,000, $133,000 would be the average salary for a counselor. So we have no idea, looking at this document, how much Lowell's counselor earns. They may earn more than that. They may earn less than that. If they earn more, the district will pay it. If they earn less, that's just tough. The school doesn't get to keep it, because to the district, the only thing that matters is the bottom line. As long as it all works out on the bottom line, we're good. At a specific school,
you may be getting significantly less than it says here, or significantly more. And principals won't necessarily ever get that information because it isn't relevant to them. They don't need to know that. All they need to know is how much FTE they're getting, because that's what they have to play with. So they don't have to come under a budget. They don't have to worry about going over budget. They don't get to keep the difference if they come under budget. That number there is just there to make sure that it all adds up to a specific amount at the end that SPS has to keep within. I hope that makes sense.
Vivian, I see a comment in the chat from Juliana. She says that she did a comparison of total salary between her school, which is West Woodland, and Northgate using the 2019 numbers. West Woodland teachers earned on average $97,000, while Northgate teachers earned on average $89,000. And then I see a question: does the extra budget allocation for special education kids go into this general fund, or do they have to prove it's being spent on the kids?
Okay, I'm going to take the second one first. So the extra budget allocation for SPED kids, you can see it right there. It's in the first section. It's where it says special ed. That's the allocation. It's staff. That's what the money is going for, is staff. That's where it goes for those additional teachers and instructional assistants for special education students. And they can mostly only work with special education students. There's a little wiggle room, but those are staff members who are dedicated to special education students. And then again, in the non-staff section, that second section down here, where it's got special ed supplies and IEP stipends and stuff like that, that's the other place where it goes. Those are the two places where it goes. And of course, they're all special education students, our general education students first. So, and you're asking about the extra budget, but yes, so it's all going to them in a sense, but that additional amount is going into staffing, and that small amount of funding, like actual money funding for specific special education related stuff. I hope that answers that. And then Juliana, who is amazing, you can get the actual salary information for every school district employee in our state. The Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction publishes that information every year, actually multiple times a year. So you can go back and try to compare these numbers. It's very time consuming. So what she's discovered is that something that is very commonly known, and it is across the country, that on average, all things being equal, schools that high poverty schools that serve communities that are low income, on average tend to have more junior staff and higher staff turnover. And that the opposite is true at non-high poverty schools. They tend to have more senior staff, less turnover. So what you'll get is a situation where your staff mix, your mix of staff members is more junior at high poverty schools and more senior at low poverty schools. And that of course affects the amount of money that you're spending on staff. So on average, the costs will be lower at a high poverty school than they are at a low poverty school. That's not necessarily true across the board. There are many exceptions. There are schools that are low poverty schools where folks are earning less. There are schools where it kind of works out to the average, but there are a significant number of schools that are in that situation. And I think I saw Juliana raise her hand. Do you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just for, if you want to do like a comparison like that, like I did, there's a lot of different kinds of numbers that you can use, but I posted in there the chat, the Kids Up Daily Sun, which doesn't incorporate all of the cost of a teacher for the district. But what I did is I just went through what Northgate like published its staff list, right? And then I made a spreadsheet and then looked up all of their funding. You know, you can find it that way and kind of get a sense about how things look in your school or your neighborhood or whatever. So just wanted to share that if you're wanting to poke around a little bit.
Thanks, Juliana.
And Vivian, there's a
yes.
question in the chat that is from Gladys, and it is in Spanish. So maybe ask Andrea if she could.
That would be awesome. I can kind of understand. Yeah. Can we get our Spanish interpreter? Is it Andrea?
This is Gladys.
Oh, thank you.
I just asked if dual language schools receive any extra funds? Because, you know, the curriculum takes a lot of time to translate in other languages. So that was my question in Spanish. Sorry, I thought that somebody could
Oh,
translate.
no, that's wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for asking in English. Sadly, I don't know any Spanish. But yeah, no, there isn't any specific additional funding for dual language schools. It's all comes from the district in much the same way. And then Carissa, yes, you are correct. You can take the FTE allocations to the bank, so to speak. But yes, those numbers don't necessarily, I mean, possibly once in a while they're correct, but that's by coincidence. How would anyone know that? Yeah. Yeah, they don't. Oh, so Ayan, an average, so it depends on the position. So Ayan has asked, how much does an average Seattle teacher cost? Oh, you got it. No, you didn't ask. I beg your pardon. Put it in there. Yeah, it just depends on the position as well. So that would be for a classroom teacher. I think an elementary classroom teacher, but.
That was on the SPS website. So someone I know earlier was asking, so I just got that from there. I had a question. I know last time, I don't know if it was you and I, but we were talking about how Washington State left a lot of money on the table. I don't know if it was the ESSER fund or was another fund, like 1 point something billion. I couldn't even look at the number without going crazy. So I was wondering, do you have any information on that?
I think that was about, I think that was a conversation we were having about public health. So, you know, our school district has been required to kind of set up a little miniature public health department inside it. I want to see I'm going over time, so I will wrap up. But and I think the conversation, what I remember hearing was that the State Department of Health had money that they hadn't used. I think that's what that was about.
Okay, I can clarify that a little bit because I've looked into that one. So the federal government gave money to states to use as far as addressing issues related to pandemic emergency funds. And then the state then takes that money and apportions it out to where they think it needs to go. So we were hearing about $1 billion in funds that was for DOH that they were not spending to support our schools. Digging into that further, that money has not been released to DOH from the OFM, from the Office of Financial Management. So that money, DOH itself doesn't have money that they're not giving to schools, but Governor Inslee, who was the one who tells OFM what to do, has not released that funding. So there is, according to Representative Paulette, about $1 billion in CARES Act funding that has not been distributed at this point in time. That money is to be used over a certain period of time. I think it goes to 2024 maybe, but don't quote me on the number there. And so one of the issues has been, why are our schools having to pull money out of their general funds in order to address public health issues? Shouldn't that money be coming from DOH? And then DOH is saying they don't have specific funding to give us. They need it from OFM. So tracing that back, this goes back towards the executive branch, is my understanding of that. And then Vivian, I saw that another question in the chat. I keep hearing that special education budgets are the first to get cut when funds decrease, but it seems like that might not actually be the case. They are different sources of funds, right? Do you want to take that first and I can jump in after?
Yeah, I can just very quickly, and then yeah, I'd love for you to jump in. Yes, they are special. They're separate budgets. They're not they're not related. So yeah, it should not be the case that, I mean, I don't think that I've heard that, but I'm going to turn it over to Sam because
So the district is they are legally obligated to serve special education students in a way that honestly they are not obligated to fund to address general education students. So when we talk about free and accessible public education, the money that it takes to make education accessible to a student, and that's what we talk about when we're talking about IDEA or special education funding, that is free and appropriate. Yes, free and appropriate. So appropriate, but it's got to be accessible. Yes. Thank you, Yana. That's appropriate is the correct term. So free and appropriate, but a free and appropriate public education. So if it's in your IEP, they are not supposed to be allowed to cut it. Is that how it works in reality? There is space between intention of the law, reality of the law, and implementation of the law. Are all of our students within Seattle Public Schools getting the accommodations that they need? No, they're not. Just flat out, no, they're not. They absolutely are not. Are some students getting the accommodations that they need? Yes. Are some students getting more than what they are under law owed? Yeah, probably. Are a lot of students getting less than what they're owed? Absolutely. I would say that in our district, it is more typical that a student who qualifies for special education is not fully having their needs met. Is that unique to Seattle? No. So I hope that helps clarify. Do we have a problem there? Yes. But when they look at these budgets and they cut things, are they cutting special education first? No, they legally should not be able to do that. So
sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Go ahead, Vivian.
I just wanted to call attention to, there's a comment in the chat from Christina Jimenez, who I know has taught special education. And I just think it's important from an advocacy perspective to think about where some of the problems may come from. And my understanding is that some of it is the structure of the programming itself, rather than necessarily, and this is not just for special education, but other parts of our budget as well, that the structure of what we're providing, which is not in any law, contributes to the cost of the programming and may not be the most efficient thing. Like, our system's not set up to look at what is the most effective and efficient for students. And that may be part of what is causing problems in terms of these allocations, in terms of the mismatch between what we're getting and what we need. So Christina, would you mind talking to that a little?
Well, I just wanted to say that the ratios, that student teacher ratios, at least at the elementary level where I'm at, is I think prevents the services or that money from being used appropriately. And I spent several hour meeting this morning with a union, and we're looking to try to change some of the numbers or some of that language in the contract for our teachers, because I think it directly impacts our students. If you have a resource room teacher who has 26 students on their caseload, because that's what your full-time resource room teachers have, K-5 across 5 different areas of service, you're going to have that teacher is going to have a great struggle meeting the needs of all those students, plus the accommodations required in the class. Imagine all the classroom teachers they're then collaborating with. And so it will lead the district to then tie the hands of those teachers to say, you've got to decrease these students' minutes, or you've got to figure out another way, and then kids' needs aren't met. So if it's not coming from funding, it's certainly coming from potentially some language in the contract that hopefully can be changed. And we're in a contract negotiation year right now. And I know that that's a priority for some of us. Thanks, Vivian.
Sam, we've eaten into your time quite a bit, so I want to see if we can.
So for stay, everybody. So advocacy drop-in hour is really just that. It is a space for people to ask questions. So Vivian, if you're up for staying with us, we can continue to take questions, both about what Vivian's been talking about around budgets, and also for those of you who might have questions about the legislative session, questions about what happens after a legislative session, all of those kinds of things. I see a question in a chat. What about LAP funding and levying funding questions and how they pertain to the budget? Yeah, you get to ask those now too. So now is free for all. Ask whatever you want. Oh, and I see that Natalia has a question. Who is on the committee that decides the WSS?
That is primarily principals and district staff. That's it.
And
like district.
Vivian, no parents, correct? No parents.
No parents. And then to Christina's question about LAP funding and levy funding. So LAP is Learning Assistance Program funding, as you may recall. And it has two components. There's LAP, sort of general. So LAP funding is intended to be used for students who are not meeting grade level standards in reading and math. I'm going to get this wrong. It's fuzzy. There are other things, it can be used for non-academic things that are impacting academic performance as well. So this is money for the systems that are called the MTSS, so the multi-tiered systems of support, which is academic and behavioral intervention services that are for students who don't qualify for an IEP. And then PBIS, which is positive behavior intervention and supports, is sort of a companion. I think the teachers here will be hearing me say this and saying no. So please jump in if I've got that wrong. But that's kind of the companion on the social, emotional, behavioral side. So LAP has two components. One is sort of a general pot that is allocated on the basis of students receiving free and reduced lunch, but doesn't have to be used for those students. It's meant to be directed at any student who has those learning needs, who is falling short of standards. And then there's a special allocation called High Poverty LAP, which is specifically allocated to individual schools. So that the pot of general LAP funds can be distributed anywhere in the district. The district can decide how they're going to distribute that. They can distribute it all at schools that are 50% FRL, or they can distribute it evenly across the district. They can decide. And that is where I think some of the equity tiering probably does come in. And then the High Poverty LAP is actually tied to specific schools. So if your free and reduced lunch enrollment was 50% or more last year, you get that High Poverty LAP money to be used for that same purpose. So it is restricted in terms of what it can be used for, but in our district, it tends to be used to hire academic interventionists, so interventionists for reading and interventionists for math. And then because it's allocated, I actually don't have any insight into exactly how that's allocated within the district, but it looks like it's probably it's generated by FRL, and it's probably allocated that way too. So if you're at an extremely low poverty school or high income community, you're probably going to get 0.2 in that LAP instruction category. And that's to hire someone in that position. And of course there isn't any way to hire someone at 0.2. So often that's an area that's difficult to staff in a school that does not have a high enrollment of kids in free and reduced lunch. I saw that Kristen had her hand up and then put it down. So
yeah, Kristen, did you want to ask a question?
I don't know, it might be a stupid question. It might have been answered already, but in the budget, there was something called above model, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't figure out what that meant, and I apologize if you said it already.
No, I actually hadn't mentioned it. So above model, that's there every year. That line is there every year, but it doesn't always have anything in it. This year, what it's for is the state added additional funding to the prototypical school model specifically for, and Sam, I hope you can correct me. I'm gonna get this
Yeah,
wrong.
I can talk about 1664 after that. There's a question in the chat about it too, but if you want to talk, if you want to say anything
I'll do
else.
the very quick version. for counselors, social workers, and psychologists and nurses, I think. Have I got that right, Tim? I think that's right,
So,
Tim.
so why don't I just jump into 1664? So right now, as everybody knows, legislative session is wrapping up, or maybe you don't know, but as I've been talking a lot about, legislative session is starting to wrap up. There are two bills that, and I'm seeing questions about both of them in the chat. 1664, which is changes to the prototypical funding formula, and 1590, which is enrollment stabilization. Since 1664 came up first, I'm going to talk about that first. So 1664 increases the state allocations that go into the prototypical formula for nurses, counselors, social workers, and those kinds of jobs. They're calling the title was something about staffing for physical, social, and emotional safety type staff. Okay. The legislature was very interested this year in what it would be referred to as putting a fence around that money, saying, so normally the legislature determines how much money a school district gets based on a formula called the prototypical formula that assumes an average school size of 450 students. And they put money into the bucket that way, hand that bucket to the district, and then the district, according to their procedures, their processes in Seattle Public Schools, the weighted staffing standard, takes the money out of that bucket and distributes it out to schools, and that's how they spend it. Some legislators didn't realize that when they were talking about prototypical formula, that districts didn't have to spend exactly according to the prototypical formula. So they wanted to put a fence around it, especially since we've been hearing a lot of talk about, hey, the prototypical formula for Seattle, it funds nine nurses. We have to go to levy dollars to staff that up to 68. So you're going to hear from legislators that they are so excited about this massive investment that they have made in public schools across the state for staffing up the prototypical formula. And I want to say two things. One is, yes, they invested a lot. We'll see at the end of session exactly how much they've put in that, but we're talking about $700 million statewide. So that is a big investment. We want to say thank you for that. However, 9 nurses, right? We've been buying up so that we've been spending at 768. The amount of money that fence goes around that is going to now make districts spend all the money that we say is for nurses on nurses, it doesn't bring us above what we've been using our levy money for. So will we be seeing a change in nurses, counselors, social workers, things like that? I would expect to. Will we miraculously now have all of the social, emotional, physical safety staff that we want? No, right? That so-called fence that legislators have been talking about is fairly meaningless when it comes to Seattle, if that makes sense. So yes, this was an investment. Yes, this is good. Yes, we should be happy about it. No, it's not enough. And then next, I will say 1590. That's the enrollment stabilization bill. Enrollment stabilization is what we need desperately, because when Vivian was talking about the budget and funding, she was talking about a lot of money was per pupil, right? And during COVID, we lost students. We're not the only district this happened to. There's a tendency to say, oh, it's your district's fault. But I want to be clear. We have 295 districts in Washington State. 230 of them lost enrollment. So that doesn't, to me, sound like it's the fault of a specific district. And when we look at losses, we saw losses beginning of the pandemic. We saw losses around Delta. We saw losses around Omicron, right? So yes, we're losing students for other reasons. We always lose students. We also always gain students. students move in and out of the district. There's a lot of reasons. If you talk to one family, they'll have their own specific set of reasons. But overall, there's this additional layer of enrollment loss due to pandemic. Well, what does that mean? It meant that funding suddenly and dramatically would disappear. So the way the legislature works, there's a long session and a short session. We're in the short session now. The long session is when they do their budget and they looked at what they expected to fund based on how many students they expected to fund, and they allocated a certain amount of money. So when we say enrollment stabilization, what we were asking for is that they maintain that amount of money, even though the number of students in public schools has declined. If Seattle Public Schools were to have been fully stabilized for our district alone, that would have been $40 million. To be blunt, we were never going to get $40 million. We asked for it and we advocated for it, and a number of you really leaned into this. And what I want to tell you is that you should feel good because we did get enrollment stabilization. That bill did pass. That stabilizes our levy, which is also tied to enrollment, and also they're arguing about which the House version or the Senate version, but we're looking at somewhere between $22 and $28 million for our schools in stabilization funding, which is important and necessary and also not enough, right? So, and then the other thing that I also want to draw your attention to is that prior to the pandemic, Seattle was experiencing a trend, as you have likely all noticed. It's expensive to live in Seattle, and families are getting pushed out of Seattle. And so our enrollment was projected to decline due to families not being able to afford to stay in Seattle. We've been seeing a trend of enrollment in Seattle public schools starting to decline as enrollment in areas where the cost of living is, where the cost of housing is cheaper, starting to go up. So we've been seeing that happening. So that's also an underlying thing that plays into how this will all move forward. So, and is it even across the district? No, it's not. Some schools lost more, some schools lost less. That all has to get figured out. But what we were asking for was stabilization. We got some. Senator Rolfes described it as splitting the difference. What we got is really, really critically important. But it doesn't mean that you won't feel anything. I would also like to add, and I think that parents aren't completely aware of this, is that this past year, our buildings were stabilized. And so our district is currently funding more teachers and staff than they are getting in funding from the allocations. So when you're feeling like why is enrollment stabilization so important? Well, what you've got in your building right now, even if it doesn't feel like you've got enough, that is already stabilized and stabilized at a higher level than the stabilization money that we got for next year. So that's something to just kind of be aware of and to keep that in mind. So yes, we've made progress. This is a good thing. We did a good job. We faced opposition to enrollment stabilization. We faced organized, active opposition. People testifying and signing in, the public testifying and signing in, saying that they did not want public schools to be stabilized. So the advocacy work that people did is critically important. But that's where that sits. Does anybody have a question about either 1664 or 1590 enrollment stabilization or changes to the prototypical formula. Feel free to just come off mute and ask me to.
While
And
you're
then-
waiting for questions.
Yep,
Oh, sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead,
Oh, no,
Vivian.
there's a couple other questions in the chat that I was wondering.
Well,
if
I
you
was
could
just
go-
going to say, while I am talking about bills, I want to say thank you to everybody who advocated for increasing language access in public schools. That bill has passed both the House floor and the Senate floor. They need to do something called concurrence, where they just need to make sure that the House version and the Senate version match up. It does not look like there are any barriers. We are fully expecting that bill to get signed into law. We have heard that the personal stories that testifiers have shared, that some of you on this call have shared, the written testimony, the remote testimony, the signing in, all of that made a really big difference. And this is huge. And it's also not going to cure everything, and is a first step. So we have more work to do, but we got this through, and we're really excited about that. So thank you to everybody for everything you've done on that. And special thanks to our interpreters who have helped make it possible to connect with community that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to connect with. And Yana is asking, what is there to do this week? Pay attention to your emails. There might be times when I do ask for people to email legislators. It's unlikely, where legislative session ends on the 10th. Right now, most of what is happening is going to be behind closed doors and inaccessible to us. And I am seeing that Juliana has her hand raised, and then Sabrina.
Can I, Sam, just before we go to,
Mhm.
to those two folks, can I just, there's a question that's been sitting here for a while from Nancy
Mhm.
in the chat. So I am backing up to the funding part. I hope that's okay.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so her question is, our school receives city levy dollars, and at a recent levy meeting, there was discussion about performance pay. The teachers hadn't heard of that before. I wonder if you have any more information. And that kind of blows my mind that the teachers hadn't heard of it. If you remember, we were talking about the city levy, which is a competitive levy that schools have to apply for specifically, and there are always more applicants than there are schools that receive the money. The way that that's paid out to schools, it's paid directly by the city through the school district, but it's paid out by the city. And the way that it is structured is that I believe it's 75% of the amount of the grant is available on condition that, well, it's given to the school. And then if you actually demonstrate growth in the specific areas that you said you would, at the end of the year, you will get the remaining 25%, less the 10% that the district takes to administer the grant. That's not just from that 25%, that's from the whole thing. So you get a grant, just under 10% goes to the district for administration, and then the school gets the remainder. But that additional 25% is called performance pay, and it only becomes available if the school can demonstrate that it met the goals that it set out in the plan that it gave to the city at the beginning of the year, that students met standard essentially, or that whatever proportion of students that you said would meet standard at the end of the year actually did so, or demonstrated growth, or whatever your metric is. Once you get that money, you can do whatever you want with it. It is 100% discretionary money. It's like PTA money. There are no conditions on it. It goes into, before when I was pointing out the per pupil funding and the funding that's linked to free and reduced lunch, it's equivalent to that. It goes into the school sort of bank account with the district and becomes money that can be used for anything. So that's what that money is. And I will turn.
All right, so I think we were going to go Juliana and then Sabrina.
Okay, I was chatting with Vivian here and she was answering, and I feel like I still don't quite get it. And we're going to have our PTA meeting on Tuesday, and I'd like to be able to try to explain the enrollment stabilization piece. So we got some, not what we wanted, but maybe 22 to 28 million dollars after they
Right.
decide, right? Okay. And that's going to come to SPS in 2 years, next year, some point. Is there a timeline for that disbursement?
So that should just get doled out as part of the allocation. That's now money.
Okay. And so then my follow-up is all that budget information that came out, like, was it just a few days ago for what next year is going to look like? Does that include this enrollment stabilization information in it? That is, okay, that's what you're trying to say. That has it all in there.
Oh, well, okay, sort of.
Okay.
So the folks in the district have been following this conversation in the legislature incredibly closely, right? So they're factoring that into their predictions about how much money they have. So they might need to make an adjustment if something goes wildly different. But the closer we get to the end of session, the firmer those numbers, the more that they feel like, okay, this is going to be something that we know we've got, right? So that's if something goes wildly off the rails, which politicians don't like to do that, right? Because all that causes stress. But if there were to be a mythical something, then the district that came out of nowhere that the district wasn't expecting, then that could change something. But no, I am expecting that as they're figuring out these allocations, that they didn't make a plan assuming no stabilization. They kept updating their plan based on the conversations that were coming out and what they were expecting and what they were seeing. So no, I don't expect that at the end of session there will be like a huge yay and throw cash around.
Okay. So the messaging is, we did it, and it could have been a lot worse, even though it feels really hard right now, but it could have been even worse without our advocacy, something like that.
Yes. So it's similar to how we talk about the levy, right? Like, yay, we got that passed. It's not going to feel like a ton of new money, but imagine if we didn't have it.
Okay. I just wanted to get that crisp for Tuesday. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you
Absolutely.
for everything that you do. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sabrina.
So I just want to say 3 things now. I don't know if people know that Jolynn Burgee comes from Olympia. She is the first CFO that Seattle Public Schools has had that really understands the interworkings of Olympia, has mad respect from our legislators, and that's why we're able to get this information the way that we do. So I do want to say that because I'm not sure if everyone knows that. The other piece on the City of Seattle performance pay, sometimes that is problematic. It was very problematic during the pandemic when staff was short and so much has been dumped on our buildings, and there's inequities in it. The principal does benefit from it. Teachers do not really understand it. And for schools who have strong administrators, who have a strong team, even writing the grant, that works. But for schools who don't, there's inequity in that whole process. And there's also inequity in how we do performance pay. So I just want to say that. And then the last thing that I want to say is, in advocacy, the most powerful thing is your story. And so that's what shifted it. A lot of these legislators, they haven't had a kid in school. They have no understanding of what we're going through what we're navigating, and they're making these decisions. And so when we go in and tell our story, and better yet, add some data and some statistics to it, that is the game changer. And I learned that in 2010, 2011. And so even like school board meetings and all of that, please know your story is powerful, and that's what moves the needle.
Thank you, Sabrina. And yes, I cannot stress enough how important your stories are. There are lots of different ways that people learn and take in information, but politicians, the thing that they have in common is that they trade in story. They learn from story. They make their points through stories. It's embedded in their systems, and there's the way they handle testimony and the way they do floor speeches and the way they talk to the press. Everything is about story, and story is a form of currency. So politicians like money, that's why they fundraise, but they also need stories, and they need stories in order to help illustrate their points. Most people and most politicians don't like to just listen to data. They like to have it be a little bit more interesting with a personal story. How does this impact somebody in our district? How does this impact somebody in our state? Story's not enough, though. They also need data to back it up. So when we can combine our story with data, that's the most powerful. But don't feel like if all you've got is story, that's not incredibly valuable. What moves politicians is your story. So honor the value of the stories that you have. And make sure you're telling them to the right people. Also, honor yourselves and the trauma that sometimes telling your story might cause. And feel free to reach out and say, am I telling my story to the right people? Because reliving a trauma by telling your story to somebody who can't change the situation, that takes a lot of energy. So when you say, this happened, and this is how it impacted me, and this is how it impacted my family, and this is how it impacted my friends, and you're talking to somebody who can make a change, that can be the thing that makes them make the change that you need. But if you're telling that story to somebody who can't do anything about it, then you and they might feel a little bit frustrated. So one of the things that we're here as council to help you with is to make sure that your story gets to the right people, because your story matters and your lived experience matters, and how these things land on you, how bills impact you, it matters. And even the legislators who do have students in public schools, they only have their kids, right? They don't have kids in all the schools across the state. They don't have kids in all the different parts of Seattle. They don't have kids at elementary, they might have one kid. They might have 4 kids. Their kids might have different needs than your kids. So giving them that whole picture becomes really, really important. There are so many things that they don't know, and that you can tell them. And that's why what we're doing here is just so incredibly important. You have so much value in your lived experience, and I cannot stress that enough. And there was a question in the chat. Karen has a question in the chat. Considering racial equity, what do we, and now my chat just moved, hang on. To scroll back up, sorry. Considering racial equity, what do you think would be the most impactful way of increasing funding equity in our district? Is it revising the WSS, creating a pool of fundraising money across the district to redistribute? Where should we be pushing to create change? Vivian, I'm going to let you jump into that first.
You bet. I would say that the number one thing that we need to be able to advocate at all is transparency. Right now, we do not have any real level of transparency about what actually happens to all the money that comes into the district. So we know what it looks like before it comes in, and we know what our schools look like, but it's very hard to go back and find actual information about spending. And that's not because anyone's keeping it from us. It's just because the systems aren't set up to do that. So right now, that to me is like, that's the first thing we need to do before we can advocate, because we don't really know what we need to advocate for until we can find I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence around what the problems are. We have a pretty good idea of where there are inequities within the system. So for example, if you think back to where I had those 4 boxes, and this is the way money comes in and this is the way it goes out. I mentioned that grants and city levy funds are applied to schools after the WSS process is done. So after staff and funds are allocated to schools, then those things come in. So those things are on top of WSS. We don't know the extent. So if you want to just talk about PTA funds, we don't know the extent of the money that's going into schools from PTAs. We have no way to know what that is or what it looks like. Parts of it are transparent, parts of it are accessible, and many parts of it are not. So we can't talk about pooling fundraising or reforming PTA donations until we know what's actually happening. And there are other parts of this that aren't transparent as well. So for example, where I was talking about the amounts that were denominated for staff that are not real numbers, where we need to have access to those numbers. And there is some information that's now available, but it's very difficult to connect. Everything's recorded in a different way, so it's still hard to see into what's happening. So that's not an answer to your question, but it's the next question we need to ask to be able to answer your question.
So when I think about this, there's different ways to think about it. I think we need to make sure that we are looking at equity at each of the levels and advocating for it at each of the levels. I think that the closer you are to your school, the more you'll feel it, right? But that when we look at federal funding, when we look at state funding and how that gets rolled out, there's a lot of education that needs to happen. I think I don't think that there is a level where this isn't an important conversation, I guess would be my perspective on that. And that doesn't feel like a really satisfying answer. I guess the other thing I would say is at different times of the year, there's different room to lean into different kinds of conversations. And being aware of when the conversations are happening and where they're happening becomes important. So
her hand up, sorry.
Oh,
Vivian.
Sabrina. Okay, Sabrina, did you want to jump in?
Vivian.
Or Vivian. Vivian, your hand's up too.
That's okay, Sabrina.
Vivian, go ahead.
Sabrina, go ahead.
You go ahead, Vivian.
Okay. I was just going to say the other, in a more substantive way, I think that the conversation needs to start by making sure that we're putting students at the center of the process of budgeting. I don't think that's the case now. I think that the process doesn't start with everyone sitting down and saying, how do we need to organize the resources we have to serve the students we have? The process just doesn't work that way. It's very adult focused, and there are specific reasons for that. But that to me would be the number one substantive thing that we could do to start to address some of the inequities in the way that we are sending money out to schools. And I think that our school board is trying to focus on that in a broad sense, and I'm hoping that that will also be a focus for our budget, our district finances as well.
Sabrina, do you want to go, and then?
Yeah, I just want to say another piece, and I don't know if it's 2 or 3 years. I think I can take this off. There's nobody there. The district has been doing a great job of what they call participatory budgeting. They've been doing it around a few equity buckets, Black studies, ethnic studies, since time immemorial, and a couple other. But that's, they've really developed a really good process of bringing voices in. And I really think that that's an important tool that we learn to have, not only at the district, but in our PTAs, to really open it up to having voice and transparency in the budget. People come and explain budget, but not very often we as community, just our knowledge and our impact. And I know I did serve, not last year, I don't know, a couple of years, the first year that they did it, and I know they've improved it, and it made a huge difference. And the knowledge and information was knowledge and information that was not being considered. So I just think as we really look at funding and how we do our money, I think we need to have those skills to have participatory budgeting, and that's the transparency and making sure we understand the impact and unintended impact of our budget decisions. And yes, it should be classroom and student focused, making sure our teachers have what they need for students' outcome, but so often they get what's left.
And I do want to take a moment to put in a plug for our 7 p.m. March 15th conversation with Assistant Superintendent of Business and Finance, Jolyn Berge. We will actually, March 15th, be talking a bit about participatory budgeting, a bit about what happened this legislative session, and then what does that mean? Like, how do we shift towards looking at weighted staffing standard, the WSS, and participatory budgeting? And then we're going to be spending the following 2 months digging deeper as well. So we've got 3 conversations with Assistant Superintendent of Business and Finance, Jolyn Berge, coming up. The next one's on the 15th, then there'll be one in April, and then one in May. Vivian, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Sabrina said just then about participatory budgeting and what you were saying. And I totally agree. That's a really powerful thing that they're doing there. The problem is that it's tinkering around the edges. I mean, we've got everything's allocated, and then there's this tiny little bit that's left over. And that's where participatory budgeting has been allowed to come in. It needs to be in the center of the process. It needs to not be, we've allocated 99.8% of the budget, and here's a little bit that we can tinker with. It needs to be, that process needs to be incorporated into the way that we make school budgets.
And I will say that Jolyn was one of the people who advocated for participatory budgeting. And so if we can let her know that A, we appreciated that she advocated for that, and B, we want more. This would be an important space for that too. And then Elisa, do you want to come off mute, or do you want me to read?
Sure. So my younger son goes to John Muir. John Muir has received FEP funds, and they make a huge change in our school. However, that grant writing process is onerous. It basically requires a huge amount of time and effort from the principals. The last time we had a different principal, and we really needed her to be able to focus on other things going on in the school, and there are only so many hours in the day. It's a very, very large grant to write. And I'm curious how we could best advocate at the city level, like who we should talk to, how we should talk to them to maybe reduce the burden. I understand there are so many things in grants and there are requirements, But a lot of schools are standing to lose parts or all of their vice principals who kind of pick up the slack while the principal's writing those grants. And those grants are supposed to be helping the schools that need it the most. So it would be really great to hear more about how we could help that streamline that process so that it was more user friendly and was able to best reach those who really need it.
Go ahead, Vivian.
Oh, I was just going to say APs are one of those things that get jockeyed over every year. And what happens inside WSS is there are different kind of, I don't think interest groups is the right word, but people coming with different perspectives and different needs. And they essentially try to figure out how to satisfy all those needs with what they have. And every year something gets pushed out or left off the table. So there was a big discussion last year about assistant principals and about which schools should have them, and about right now the way assistant principals are allocated, at least at the elementary level, is based on the number of classroom teachers that you have. And it's a provision in the Principals Association contract that says that any principal that has to supervise more than 23 certificated teachers will get an assistant principal, and then can get more than one depending on how many teachers are in the building that they are required to supervise. So that's kind of in there. So if your school meets that requirement, you will still get an AP. But if you drop below that, so the number of teachers is obviously allocated based on enrollment. So if your enrollment drops, your number of teachers will drop, and then you may lose your assistant principal. So there was a discussion around whether assistant principals could be allocated even to schools that didn't reach the threshold for an AP. And that was not done this year because it was used for other things.
Sorry,
And
could I
oh, go ahead.
I don't think I was very clear. I apologize. The issue is more that those deal grants are really, really long, and it basically pulls the principal away. And so my first question is, who should we direct our inquiries or stories or advocacy towards at the city level? And I think Sabrina helped with that. And also, how should we tailor that message to say, like, it's a big task in trying to fix a problem, like kind of creating another problem.
Yeah. Sabrina?
So I just really want to speak on that. So it is, good afternoon. It is an onerous job, and I'll just give you an example. So a little while ago, Graham Hill went out for a grant with South Shore. The two principals came together, sat during school hours to write that grant, and they were out of the building for a week and a half. So just think of all the things that didn't happen. So it definitely speaks to what John Muir was saying. There's huge inequities. And then some people have a gift for writing grants. People who write grants deficit-based normally don't get it. And so there's huge inequities. And there's huge inequities that I see in the whole grant process. And Dwayne Chappelle, and really let him know the importance of it. So right now we have a mayor who's excited about partnering with Seattle Public Schools, who's not only excited about that, but looking at repurposing our community centers to be more wraparound, to support our schools better. So I'm just saying that this is the time and this is an opportunity, and we will not have equity until we get it right. The schools who have the least will not get the grant, and those who have the most ability and staffing are the ones who will get it. And those grants are over a long period of time. And so if you miss it, and you don't have a chance until the next round. And that's a huge issue.
Yeah, so that I would like to stress that again is that when the state underfunds our schools, so that principals have to go out looking for grants, so that we have to scrape together levy dollars. When we have all of these different pieces and we're using all this energy to try and make sure that we can continue to operate, it creates vast inequities. I also want to say that I'm seeing that it is 2:56 and we do have a hard stop because we've hired interpretation until 3. So I want to give Vivian a chance to wrap up, and I'll wrap up, and then we'll talk about kind of next steps kinds of things. So Vivian, when can people see you again?
I don't have any planned appearances, but it does sound like there's some appetite to continue this conversation. And a couple of you have reached out to me individually, and I did put my email in the chat again. I am more than happy to talk to anyone at great length about this until your eyes glaze over. So please do reach out to me. We may plan something else pretty soon since it is budget season right now. And I just wanted to close by thanking all of you, and especially our interpreters, for being here. It's just a great space to share. Thank you.
So, like Vivian, I want to say thank you to everybody for spending this time on a beautiful Saturday with us. And I also want to thank everybody for the advocacy that you have been doing and continue to do, and to let you know that just because legislative session's coming to an end, this is just the beginning. We have so many more things that we need to do. A lot of advocacy work, a lot of state level legislative advocacy work happens during the interim, when there's more space for longer conversations with legislators. And so then this is actually the last of these in-session weekly meetings, and we'll see what people want to do moving forward. So definitely email me about what you'd like to see happen. But the next event that we have coming up is the meeting that I referenced with we've been calling them money talks or conversations about budget with Assistant Superintendent of Business and Finance, Joe Limburgi. And we shifted to the money talks name because it sounded a little more exciting. But these conversations have been really, really good. And they've been fun and enjoyable and so informative. And I encourage your full community to come. We are having interpretation and live transcription, closed captions. And if people in your community need a language that we have not already planned interpretation for, please reach out so that we can make arrangements. But we're planning on Somali, Spanish, and Cantonese interpretation for that. But there will also be more to come. And I'm noticing Sabrina mentioned in the chat starting to talk to representatives and community. And yes, I am going to be sending out some emails to your advocacy chairs. So we need to start having our after session conversations, and there's just a lot more to come. My email is in the chat, but please do come on the 15th and keep in touch with your building level PTA, because they will be hearing from council. And some of you may have students who saw me in their classroom this week, and some of you may have students who will see me in their classrooms in the coming weeks, because I've had teachers starting to invite me in to talk to students about how they can advocate. So that's exciting. Youth voice is critically important. So it is 3:00 and we're going to let you all go, but I want to say thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to everybody for being here. And until we meet again, bye all.